What if the CEO of a billion-dollar company walked through the front door, and no one recognized him? What if the only person who treated him with kindness was the janitor? And what happened next? Shook the entire company from the inside out. Before we dive into the story, don't forget to like, share this video, and subscribe to the channel to help us reach 1,000 subscribers. Your support means the world to us and inspires us to create even more engaging content. Thank you. Monday morning came quiet and early over the polished glass lobby of Greystone Holdings. The sun had just begun slipping through the tall windows, lighting up the marble floor in a soft golden hue. Everything gleamed: the counters, the nameplate behind reception, the security desk by the elevator bay. It was the kind of place where shoes didn't squeak, and conversation came in soft, calculated tones. A man stepped in from the sidewalk, holding the door for himself. His coat was worn, a little too heavy for spring, and the leather satchel over his shoulder had clearly seen better years. His shoes weren't polished, and his steps weren't hurried. He looked like someone who didn't belong here, and Greystone was a place where people noticed when you didn't belong. The security guard, a younger guy with a sharp haircut and a clipboard in hand, straightened up. "Sir, do you have an appointment?" The man smiled gently. "No, just visiting. Thought I'd see how things were going." There was a pause, the kind where someone isn't sure whether to call for backup or let the moment pass. Eventually, the guard gave a stiff nod and waved him through with the kind of caution reserved for someone harmless. But odd, no one noticed the flicker in the man's eyes when he looked up at the etched Greystone logo on the wall. No one recognized him either. Richard Hale, founder, first CEO, the man who once built this empire with nothing but a second-hand laptop and a loan, walked across his own lobby like a stranger. It had been 3 years since he'd stepped foot inside. 3 years working remotely, fading from the spotlight, letting others run the company. But something had been gnawing at him. Whispers of internal coldness, departments where no one smiled, a culture that rewarded results but forgot decency. He hadn't wanted to believe it. Not at first. But silence from the top only hides rot for so long. Now, here he was. No grand entrance, no press release, just a quiet walk through the halls of what used to be his life. He wandered through the atrium, where employees passed him without a second glance. The front desk barely looked up. A junior executive brushed past him, muttering something under his breath when Richard didn't move fast enough. Another woman at a shared table glanced at him, then back at her laptop. Clearly uninterested, he found a quiet corner near the back of the break area. A vending machine buzzed. A half-finished coffee sat abandoned on the counter. Nobody asked if he needed help. Nobody cared that he was there. Except one. Carlos, pushing a cart of cleaning supplies, glanced his way. He was in his late 40s, maybe early 50s, with sleeves rolled to his elbows and a dust rag slung over one shoulder. He paused for a moment, then offered a small nod. "Long day?" he asked. Richard smiled, just taking it all in. Carlos looked at him for a beat, then went over to the coffee machine. "You want one? Looks like you've been standing here a while." "I wouldn't say no." Carlos poured a fresh cup, handed it over without ceremony. "Here, not the best, but it's hot." Richard took it, surprised at how much warmth could come from something so simple. "You new around here?" Carlos asked, genuinely curious. "In a way," Richard replied, then took a sip. Carlos didn't press. He just wiped down a counter and kept moving, humming to himself under his breath. Richard sat in silence, watching, not just Carlos, but everyone else. The way people moved, the way they treated each other, or didn't. The moments in between the meetings. That's where a company's soul really lived. And right now, he couldn't find much of it. But he did find something else. Something steady, kindness, without motive, a quiet gesture, from someone no one really saw. Richard made a mental note, not just of names, but of patterns, of how power showed itself, and how character often didn't. He stayed a little while longer, blending into the background. Then he stood up, set his cup down, and gave Carlos a nod. "Thank you," he said. Carlos nodded back. "Anytime." Richard walked toward the elevator, slow and thoughtful, the weight of the building somehow heavier than when he'd walked in. Tomorrow would come, and when it did, The man everyone thought had disappeared would step back into the light, this time. Not to take back control, but to remind everyone what it was supposed to mean. Morning sunlight crept through the frosted windows of the executive floor, casting long shadows across the quiet hallways. The usual chatter of early emails and espresso machines had already filled the building. But there was a sharper edge to it today. Something about the air felt tighter, like the space between people had grown just a little colder. Lena Whitmore stepped into the corner office that once belonged to Richard Hale, now repurposed as the central command center for Greystone's Culture Evolution Project. She adjusted the sleeve of her blazer, her movements crisp and calculated, then dropped her laptop bag on the polished credenza. She didn't notice that one of the original brass nameplates, Hale's, still rested inside the drawer. Half covered by old documents no one bothered to archive. Lena was the architect of Greystone's modern identity. She spoke often of streamlining, of performance over personality, of cutting the fat from a company that had once been more family than firm. And to some, she was brilliant, sharp, data-driven, tireless. But to others, she was something colder, harder to define, an operator in heels, trading warmth for quarterly gains. In the morning's leadership meeting, she stood at the head of the long glass table, chin slightly lifted, her voice carried, not loud, but firm. "We've removed the last of the redundant roles," she announced, her tone devoid of regret. "Our new workforce is lean, responsive, and fully aligned with performance metrics. No more room for underachievers or legacy loyalty." There were nods around the table, some out of agreement, some out of habit. In the meantime, Richard Hale was making his way through another floor, this time finance. No one gave him more than a passing glance. A few junior analysts cracked a joke when he wandered too close to a restricted server room. "Hey, think that guy's lost?" one of them whispered to his coworker. "Maybe he's looking for the cafeteria," the other snorted. "Or maybe he's just confused. You know how they get when they're old." Richard didn't react. He'd heard worse, but he made note of the names on their badges. Later, he reached the tech wing, usually off limits unless you had a specific clearance. One of the rooms caught his eye. No signage, no activity listed on the internal system. Just a locked door with a keypad. He tried to ask a technician walking by. A young guy, earbuds in, hoodie pulled over his head. "Excuse me," Richard said calmly. "Can you tell me what this room is used for?" The technician barely slowed down. "You shouldn't be here," he snapped. "And who are you supposed to be? Anyway, some kind of auditor?" Richard didn't answer. He just stood there, absorbing the hostility, the disinterest, the strange mix of fear and arrogance. He walked away quietly. By noon, he was back in the break area near the basement level. Carlos spotted him again and waved him over. "Hey, you look like you could use lunch," he said, pulling a second plastic tray from the cart he'd rolled in from the kitchen. Richard accepted it with a quiet thank you and joined him at a folding table no one else ever used. Carlos talked while they ate. Not too much, just enough. He mentioned how he used to write code, worked for a small tech firm before the layoffs hit during the pandemic. His wife passed away around the same time, and suddenly he had a daughter to raise, rent to cover, and no backup plan. "I started cleaning buildings just to keep a roof over our heads," he said, not bitter, just honest. "Didn't think I'd still be doing it 3 years later. But here I am." "You do it with more grace than most," Richard replied. Carlos chuckled. "Grace doesn't pay much, but it helps you sleep." Upstairs, an executive assistant poked her head into Lena's office. "Hey, just a heads up, there's a man wandering the floors. No badge. I think security saw him talking to some of the staff." "Maintenance?" Lena asked without looking up. "Not sure. Could be a courier or one of the inspection guys. No one's flagged him yet." "Then he's not our problem," Lena said, waving her hand dismissively. "We've got more important things to clean up." By the end of the day, Richard was back in his apartment. It was quiet, a small place in the city. Nothing like the estate he once owned in Connecticut. He opened his laptop, typed in a familiar login, and accessed a private server. From there, he watched footage from the building's internal cameras, ones that still, by some oversight or quiet favor, reported to a master account tied to his founder's access. He watched his own movements through the lens of an observer, cataloging every interaction, every moment of kindness, or lack of it. He made notes, faces, names, departments. When he got to Carlos, he paused, hit the spacebar, watched again. He opened a folder labeled Priority and dragged Carlos's employee file inside. Back at Greystone, Lena stood by her window, drink in hand, staring out over the city. Clean house, she said to the room, though no one else was there, before someone comes looking under the rug. That night, at exactly 11:58 p.m., an internal memo went out from the Ethics and Oversight Committee. Subject line: Mandatory Executive Meeting. Location: Conference Hall. A time: 8 a.m. No agenda, no explanation, but it got everyone's attention. Because no one remembered authorizing it. And nobody knew that the man who sent it had already been walking their halls for 2 days. The air in Conference Room 21 felt heavier than usual. At 8 a.m. sharp, the entire senior leadership team and department heads of Greystone Holdings shuffled into the wide, glass-lined space, their voices hushed, their eyes darting toward each other. No one had a clue what this meeting was about. The email had arrived late in the night, carrying only a time, a location, and a sender that made most folks blink twice: Ethics Oversight Committee. Most had forgotten Greystone even had one. The room was usually reserved for investor summits or end-of-quarter board briefings. The carpet had been vacuumed to perfection. Polished wood lined the walls. An LED screen stretched the length of one side. Silent and black for now. As people took their seats, a strange silence settled in. The kind where no one wanted to be the first to ask what was going on. Lena Whitmore, head of human resources, entered 10 minutes late, coffee in hand, chin held high. She leaned over to one of her deputies and whispered, "This might be the final shake-up. Let's hope they let us finish what we started." She straightened her blazer, adjusted her glasses, and looked around like a general surveying her troops. Then the door opened, but it wasn't security or legal. And it wasn't the usual chair from the board. A man in a tailored gray suit walked in, shoulders squared, eyes sharp beneath a head of gray that still held its weight. His steps were even, purposeful. 2 assistants followed close behind, carrying nothing but quiet certainty. It took a moment for people to react. A few stood, instinctively. Others remained frozen, eyes narrowing in disbelief, mouths slightly parted. Lena's coffee slipped an inch in her hand. Her posture faltered. Richard Hale didn't introduce himself. Instead, he nodded toward the assistant at the back, who tapped a key on the laptop. The screen lit up. A silent video began to play. There was no narration, no dramatic music, just security footage, first from the front lobby, where an older man in a faded coat stood quietly, ignored by the front desk. Then the break room, where he sat alone while others passed him by. Then outside a restricted hallway, where a technician brushed him off without so much as a glance. Finally, a short clip. The same man, him, carrying a cafeteria tray. Seated next to Carlos, sharing a quiet moment that no one else saw fit to offer. The video ended. The room stayed silent. Richard looked around, his voice calm but steady. "How many of you saw me yesterday?" A few hands twitched. No one raised theirs. He paused, letting the silence grow roots. "How many of you acted in line with the values we've had etched on our walls for 25 years?" He didn't need an answer. Their faces were enough. Lena cleared her throat but didn't speak. A regional VP shifted in his seat. Richard moved the presentation forward. A photo of Carlos filled the screen. Candid, warm, mid-laugh, handing over a cup of coffee with one hand while holding a mop in the other. "This man," Richard said slowly, "is the only person who treated me like a fellow human being. Not because he knew who I was. Not because he expected anything in return. But because he believes that dignity shouldn't be earned by title." Someone near the front tried to recover. "Sir, with all due respect, many of us didn't recognize you. Had we known." Richard's voice didn't rise, but it cut clean. "If I were no one, would that excuse your behavior? Is kindness something we only extend when there's something in it for us?" The words hung in the air like fog. He let them sit for a moment longer, then stepped aside. "I built this company on trust, on shared values. We were never perfect, but we knew how to treat each other. Somewhere along the line, we stopped asking what kind of people we were becoming. He took a breath. That ends today. Then came the announcement. Every department head would undergo a full internal review. Not for performance, but for conduct, for character. Lena's knuckles whitened around her coffee cup. And Carlos. Richard turned toward the back of the room, where Carlos stood near the door, still in his work uniform, unsure whether to stay or slip out. Starting tomorrow, you'll report to the Cultural Development Department. We need people like you shaping what this place becomes. A few people clapped, softly. Some did it because it felt right. Others, because it felt necessary. Lena didn't clap. Richard gathered his notes, nodded once to the room, and left without another word. The doors shut quietly behind him, but the echo stayed long after. Eyes turned toward Carlos, toward each other, toward the floor. No one knew what the next day would bring, but they all understood, in one way or another, that yesterday had just ended. The air inside Greystone didn't move the same way the next morning. The usual rhythm of hallway chatter, the casual laughter at the espresso bar, even the polite small talk in the elevator, gone. Replaced by glances that didn't hold, whispered exchanges that stopped when someone walked by, and long, brittle silences that hung between colleagues like fog. Carlos, still in his custodial uniform, walked down the corridor toward Human Resources. Heads turned, but no one greeted him. The way they looked at him wasn't angry. Exactly, but it wasn't friendly either. It was the kind of look people gave when something didn't make sense to them. And they didn't like being reminded of it. When he stepped into the HR suite, a young woman stood waiting just past the front desk. She smiled as if she meant it but lowered her voice as she gestured for him to follow. "Carlos, I'm Sarah. You're meeting with me today," she said, guiding him to a glass-walled office tucked in the corner. "And, congratulations. I mean it, but I should also warn you, people are rattled. You've stirred up something." He nodded once, not out of pride or fear, just quiet acknowledgement. "They think it's a stunt," she continued, closing the door behind them. "Some kind of PR reset." "I didn't ask for this," Carlos said. "I just gave someone a cup of coffee." "That's the part they don't know how to handle," she replied, her voice softening. Meanwhile, upstairs in a private meeting room seldom used since the early board days, Richard sat with 3 other people, each of them chosen for a reason. Though none had worked together before, Carlos entered last, uncertain, still adjusting to being addressed like he belonged in rooms like this. To his left sat Martin Sloan, once Greystone's senior legal advisor, now retired and nearly forgotten. Across from him was Evan Chen, former lead systems engineer, suspended over a year ago with no formal explanation. And next to Richard was Sarah, notebook in hand, brows tight with thought. Richard opened the meeting with no preamble. "There's a reason I'm here. Not just for ethics, not just because someone forgot how to hold a door open. Something deeper has been growing in this company, and it's been kept just out of sight." He paused, then clicked a button on his tablet. A document lit up the wall screen, a ledger of internal transfers, most labeled with obscure project names and routed through non-existent subsidiaries. "I've been tracking this quietly for months. Money moving through fake contracts. Branch offices that exist only on paper. Someone is laundering through Greystone." Carlos exhaled slowly. "And you think I can help with that?" Richard leaned forward. "I don't need another auditor. I need someone who doesn't owe anyone in this building. Someone they can't predict, and who still knows what right looks like." Carlos didn't nod. He didn't smile, but his eyes held steady. Sarah added, "Over the past few months, I've noticed files disappearing from our employee database. Not retirements, not terminations, just gone. And most of them belonged to people who filed internal complaints. Some even flagged accounting anomalies." Evan folded his arms. "I flagged a cluster of irregular data from the procurement logs last year. I followed protocol, submitted the report. Within 72 hours, my credentials were revoked, and I was told to take an extended leave. That was the last I heard." Martin spoke for the first time, voice even but weathered. "I was pushed out 2 years ago when I requested an independent audit of our Mexico office. I didn't shout, I didn't threaten, just asked for transparency. The only reply I got was an anonymous email." He looked at Richard. It said, "Back away if you want to stay safe." So I did. Richard stood. "We don't have forever. If we're going to expose this, it has to be fast. We need documents. We need names. We need the full picture before they bury the rest." He turned to Sarah. "Your access still gives you reach into the HR and hiring systems." To Evan, he said, "You know the back end better than anyone. I'll get you back into the servers through a clean channel." And to Martin, "I need your legal eye on everything we find. Nothing leaves this room unless it's solid." Then he looked at Carlos. "You'll be our tether to the floor. You see what we miss. And more importantly, people talk differently around you." Carlos didn't answer right away. Finally, he said, 72 hours. Then what?" Richard's voice dropped. "Then we take it to the board. Or the press. Whichever gets us there alive." That afternoon, across the building, Lena sat alone in her private office, bathed in the gray light of a cloudy skyline. She opened her laptop, her fingers moving quickly through administrator-level access layers. She opened a folder labeled Movement Logs. There, time-stamped and quietly recorded, was a full breakdown of Richard Hale's path through the building the day before. Lobby, finance, tech corridor, even the break room. Her jaw clenched. She picked up her office phone, dialed an internal number, and waited. When someone answered, she said, "He's seen more than we thought. We need to move now." Then she hung up, staring at the screen, where Richard's face lingered in grainy black and white from a hallway camera. For the first time in a long while, the woman known for her control felt the unmistakable edge of fear. Tucked behind rows of dusty file cabinets and beneath a flickering fluorescent light, a forgotten meeting room, once an internal R&D space, had become something else entirely. The nameplate on the door was long gone. If you didn't know it was there, you'd walk right past. That's how Lena liked it. Inside, 3 people sat around a narrow table with faded coffee rings and old Ethernet ports bolted into the wall. The room didn't look like much, but what passed through it mattered more than appearances. Lena sat at the head, arms crossed, her face unreadable. Across from her was Peter Lang, the head of internal IT, who kept his hands folded tightly in his lap. To his left, Melissa Downey, a high-ranking finance executive who rarely attended unofficial meetings like this. And beside her, Jerome Miles, a gray-suited consultant brought in under the guise of compliance review. Few knew he also held credentials to the company's audit infrastructure. "Richard Hale's credentials are back online," Peter said flatly. Melissa glanced up from her tablet. "That's impossible. Those were supposed to be buried after the 2022 charter revision." "They weren't," Lena replied. They were. And someone let them loose." Jerome cleared his throat. "He's already accessed archived accounting records. And he's begun restoring shareholder-level permissions." Lena didn't flinch. "Then we don't have the luxury of time." She leaned forward. "We have 48 hours. Every mirror file, every duplicate copy in local drives. Delete them. Disable automatic backups. If there's metadata floating around, scrub it. And if you need to reroute live records to false directories, do it." Melissa hesitated. "Changing system parameters could leave a trail. So leave a cleaner one," Lena said. Meanwhile, across town in a quiet corner cafe, Richard sat at a table tucked near the back wall, away from the windows. The scent of brewed coffee and warm cinnamon hung in the air. Martin Sloan joined him first, carrying a small envelope tucked under his jacket. "From the old vault," Martin said quietly, sliding it across. "I kept it offline. Figured one day, someone might want to remember how honest work used to look." Richard opened the envelope and removed a slim USB drive. The label was handwritten, 2020 to 2023 fund transfers. Evan arrived moments later, eyes scanning the room out of habit. He sat, pulling up a folder on his tablet. "There's a flagged operation," he said, "listed under a dormant entity in Peru. Supposedly a solar project. The problem is, no reporting. No third-party verification. Nothing. Ghost branch." Martin muttered. Richard nodded slowly. "That's where the money's hiding." He looked at them both. "We split. Martin and Sarah will comb through physical contracts in archives. I want originals. Carlos and Evan, you're going back to the technical wing." Evan raised an eyebrow. "You mean the server hallway?" "Yes. Where I wasn't welcome last week. That's where the real bookkeeping lives. Back at Greystone, Carlos returned to his new desk, oddly pristine and quiet. A young man in uniform stood nearby, clipboard in hand. "Corporate assigned me to help you settle in," he said, flashing a toothy grin. "I'll just be shadowing you." Carlos didn't respond right away. The guy's badge didn't match his claimed department. He was too friendly, too polished. Later, while pretending to organize supplies, Carlos slipped into a utility closet and sent a quick message to Evan. "I'm being followed." The reply came back instantly. "Understood." That afternoon, Evan returned to the tech floor under the pretense of updating inventory logs. In a quiet moment, he knelt near a network hub and inserted a small signal relay into an outlet near the power supply. It blinked once, green. That was all he needed. Back at their monitoring setup, Richard and Martin began receiving mirrored data streams, real-time access to Greystone's hidden accounting architecture. Within 20 minutes, line items began flowing: vendor codes, routing numbers, foreign transfers to shell accounts. Evan had struck gold, but then the relay spiked. Inside the control center, a blinking red alert flagged unauthorized duplication. It only lasted 3 seconds, but it was long enough. Lena was notified within minutes. Her expression didn't change, but her next moves came fast. All new system logins, shut them down. She ordered, revoke Evan Chen, monitor Richard Hale, and for God's sake, double-check the HR terminals. They've been using their access as a backdoor. Moments later, Richard's screen froze. Then a message appeared. "I know what you're looking for, but you won't find it in time." He read it twice, then closed the laptop slowly. Across the building, in an isolated server room, a junior technician stared at the latest maintenance record. One detail made his brow furrow. "Why were these cameras moved?" he asked aloud. 2 weeks ago? That's before any of this." He clicked through the maintenance history. The system log confirmed it. Security cameras covering the tech floor had been repositioned 12 days before Richard ever returned. When the news reached him, Richard sat in silence for a long while. Then he looked out the window, watching the city move beneath him. "They were preparing for me," he said quietly, "before I even knew I was coming back." The city had gone quiet by the time Richard gathered them at an old law office near the edge of downtown. The building used to hum with litigation years ago, back when Greystone faced its first regulatory challenge. Now it stood mostly empty, just a dusty reception desk, creaky elevator, and the hum of forgotten air vents. Richard kept the key all these years. Like a bookmark in a chapter he knew he'd eventually revisit. The conference room on the 6th floor had no camera, no digital lock, just 4 chairs, a battered table, and a warm lamp. Martin arrived first, carrying a thin folder tucked under his coat. He looked older in this setting, as if the walls themselves reminded him of the weight of what they once built. "I found it," Martin said, sliding the file across the table. "It's worse than I remembered." Richard opened the folder and scanned the highlighted paragraphs. There it was. A clause buried in the handover agreements from 3 years ago. Signed under the guise of transition security, it gave Lena full authority over all corporate activities deemed strategic or operational. With discretionary oversight power, she can legally claim any of our moves fall under breach of executive control. Martin said quietly, "And if she frames it that way, it sticks." Richard nodded slowly, lips pressed together. Sarah came in next, her laptop already open before she sat down. I pulled a deeper scan from the HR archive. There's a pattern in the terminations. 4 people let go in the past 18 months for non-cooperation. She turned the screen to show a timeline. All 4 filed internal flags about budget inconsistencies tied to the Peru office. "That's not coincidence," Richard murmured. "That's cleanup." Evan arrived last, still winded from riding his bike after dark. He opened a secure drive and pulled up a string of transactions. "Take a look. This chain moves funds from a Greystone development account to a vendor called Altera Dynamics. Never declared, no affiliation in our official subsidiary list. But here," he pointed, "signatory authority? Lena Whitmore." Sarah leaned in. "She authorized payouts?" Evan nodded. "Several, each just below the threshold that would have required board-level scrutiny." Richard closed his eyes briefly. Then we've got what we need. He turned to Martin. I want you to draft a formal investigation request. Address it to Kearns and Delaney. They're still on the board. They haven't taken sides yet. Martin raised an eyebrow. They haven't taken any meetings in months. They will take this one. Richard said. They've been waiting for a reason. Meanwhile, Carlos had been working a quieter lead. An old friend named Vincent used to manage the logistics center when paper was still king. Carlos found him running a small courier dispatch out by the river. Over coffee, Vincent scratched his chin and said, "We had a floor below B. No one ever went down there." "Not since you know who stepped back?" Carlos asked. "Still accessible?" Vincent gave a half smile. "If you've got an old black card badge. Maybe." Later that night, Carlos and Evan made their way back into the building. Martin had slipped them an outdated keycard, one that should have been deactivated but, thanks to old systems nobody bothered to audit, still worked on mechanical locks. They waited until the night crew switched shifts. Then, using a side elevator usually reserved for maintenance, they descended to sub-level B. The elevator doors creaked open to reveal stale air and rows of locked cabinets. Fluorescent lights flickered, waking from years of sleep. Dust blanketed the floor like a thin snowfall. Evan broke the seal on one cabinet and pulled out thick folders, meeting minutes, payroll ledgers, interoffice memos, all handwritten or signed in ink. "This is it," he whispered. Carlos checked the back wall, where filing drawers labeled discretionary funds sat untouched. He flipped one open. Inside were stamped transfer receipts, most with destination bank accounts offshore. They began gathering what they could. Then the alarm sounded. A long, low wail echoed through the sublevel. Red lights lit up along the baseboards. The elevator behind them shut tight with a sharp mechanical click. "What did we trip?" Carlos asked. Evan rushed to a panel near the door, tapping at the manual override. "It's not us." This was remote triggered. The lights dimmed for a second. Then the screen on the far wall blinked to life. A camera feed came on. Lena's face appeared, clear as day. "I warned you," she said softly, with a coldness that made the room feel 10 degrees colder. "You thought this was about files. But you don't understand what power really means." She leaned forward. "You're not playing in the dark. You're already buried in it." Then the screen cut out. They were alone again, but the silence didn't feel empty. It felt like a warning still echoing, even without sound. The silence inside the sublevel was thick as dust. The alarm had stopped, but Carlos and Evan knew better than to assume they were safe. The room smelled like cold concrete and paper too old to breathe. Evan knelt beside the control panel, pulling open a metal casing that had likely been untouched for a decade. "This is a Gen 2 magnetic lock," he said, wiping his forehead with the sleeve of his jacket. "Before the security overhaul, I can short the circuit. But we've got one shot before backup protocols kick in." Carlos kept watch, breathing slow. He was still gripping the thick folder of documents wrapped tight in a plastic sleeve. "Let's make that shot count." Evan twisted 2 wires together, sparks flashing briefly. The red light above the door blinked, then turned green. The lock clicked softly. They pushed the heavy door open and stepped back into the dim hallway. No guards yet, no cameras moving. But they didn't linger. Within minutes, they exited the lower level, slipping through a maintenance corridor and out to the street behind the Greystone Tower. 2 blocks away, Richard's phone buzzed. The line went static for a moment. Then Evan's voice came through. "We're out. Got the papers. Meet you at the fallback site." Richard let out a breath. "We're coming to you." He, Martin, and Sarah were already in a car, halfway to the building. As shareholders with standing oversight rights, they had prepared a legal route inside, but timing was tight. Richard wasn't about to wait for another trap to spring. When they reached the building's front desk, security hesitated, unsure how to proceed. That's when Richard leaned forward and asked to speak directly with the head of security. The man who arrived, Frank Alvarez, was a familiar face. Older, gray-haired, eyes sharp behind his glasses. "I remember when you used to walk these halls every morning," Frank said with a small smile. "I still keep that plaque you signed." Richard nodded. "Then you'll understand why I need access to the lower floors. We've lost contact with 2 personnel. I have reason to believe they were trapped in a restricted area without explanation. Frank didn't speak for a long beat. Then he pulled a keycard from his coat. Follow me, but I never saw you. As they passed the second floor, Frank whispered, 2 weeks ago, someone reclassified the sublevel as a hazard zone. No one could explain why. I wasn't allowed in either. By the time they reached the alley near the service entrance, Carlos and Evan were already waiting. Their clothes were dusted, faces tense but alert. Evan handed over the secured folder. It's all there. Transactions, memos, signatures, even the deleted drafts. Back at their temporary workspace, the group spread the documents across the table. Martin, hands steady, flipped through the pages. There, he said, pointing to one transaction order. 18 million, routed through Altera Dynamics. Sarah leaned in. Authorized by Lena's office. Marked as strategic consulting. Look at the recipient, Jacob Torrance. That's the same guy she used to bring to board dinners. Said he was an advisor on future planning. Martin raised another page. This email was never sent. A junior manager drafted it, asking for an audit review. But it was printed, then redlined. Someone wrote, not aligned with company vision, and buried it. Carlos stared at the signatures. Same day those employees were fired. Richard sat back, hands folded. We have the truth, but the truth alone won't shake the tower she's built. The room fell quiet. Then Sarah spoke. I know someone. Riley Chen, investigative reporter, specializes in corporate corruption. She doesn't work for a big outlet. She plays by her own rules. Richard raised an eyebrow. Can she be trusted? She's chased bigger fish than this. And she never misses. That night, they encrypted a set of key documents, enough to paint a picture. Not enough to burn them if it leaked. Sarah contacted Riley through a burner email, using a phrase they'd agreed on years ago when Sarah was still in journalism school. By morning, Riley replied, meet me before sunrise. Bring proof. Richard called it their silent strike, a move made not through the boardroom or courtroom, but through public conscience. The kind of pressure that couldn't be silenced with a non-disclosure agreement or a settlement. As the sun rose, Richard's phone buzzed again. A number with no name. Just a short message. You're gambling with kindling. The board still answers to her. The court of opinion won't save you if she moves first. Richard read it 3 times. Eyes narrowing. He turned toward the window, watching the slow light creep over the skyline. I know, he said quietly. That's why we're going to force her hand. Right now. Richard sat across from Riley Chen in the back corner of a quiet diner just outside the city. The place hadn't changed much since he last stepped foot in it years ago. Same chipped mugs. Same creaky vinyl booths. He liked that. It made it easier to think. Riley had her notebook out, though she rarely glanced at it. Her eyes stayed fixed on him. Sharp and measured. I'm in, she said, but I need time. If I publish anything without corroboration, Lena can bury me in litigation. And she will. Richard nodded slowly. We won't rush you, but we're going to shake her tree and see what falls. Back at their temporary office, the group gathered around a whiteboard. Carlos, now acting under the official title of Cultural Development Coordinator, stood beside Richard, marker in hand. We're going to leak just enough, Richard said, to make her flinch. Sarah raised a brow. And if she doesn't, she will, Richard replied. She's too used to controlling the narrative. The moment it slips out of her grasp, she'll try to seize it back. That's when we catch her hand in the drawer. Carlos drafted the next company-wide newsletter. Tucked between updates about team-building workshops and holiday schedules was a brief paragraph. We are conducting a preliminary review of certain regional offices showing inconsistent financial activity. As part of our commitment to transparency, any concerns will be addressed in collaboration with our oversight committee. Beneath it, a chart, sanitized, names removed, but familiar to anyone who'd seen a ledger. A handful of transactions circled in red, barely visible beneath a light gray overlay. They released it late at night, when few were watching. By dawn, it had been shared in private message threads. Screenshots posted on staff forums. Former employees began commenting online. Names Richard hadn't heard in years. One tweet read, looks like Greystone's finally cracking. Took them long enough. It spread further than expected. A financial blogger picked it up. Then another. Within 2 days, a headline appeared on an independent site. Whispers at Greystone. Is a giant cracking from within? Lena, predictably, didn't take it well. She stormed into the executive conference room, shutting the blinds as if the sunlight itself was a threat. Around her were 3 of her most loyal lieutenants, people who owed her their promotions. I want the source, she snapped. Whoever pushed that internal message, whoever leaked it, find them, freeze their access, and send out a company-wide reminder that any mention of unverified branches will result in immediate disciplinary review. They moved fast, but not fast enough. Within the hour, Sarah, monitoring internal traffic, flagged an unusual bounce from Lena's email. The content had been picked up by one of the archival systems Richard had never fully surrendered. The message was clear, threatening, and now, officially recorded. Sarah smiled and forwarded it straight to Riley. By the afternoon, Riley called back. This changes everything. She's suppressing whistleblowers. I can run this. The moment she goes public to defend herself, I'll release the second piece. Meanwhile, across the executive wing, Lena was pacing. She knew something was off. The speed at which the story spread, the odd silence in meetings, the lack of panic from Richard's camp. She called Paul Granger, her last safe bet on the board. We need an emergency session. She told him, Richard's overstepped. He's exploiting legacy access. We need to revoke his shareholder privileges. Paul hesitated but agreed. Send me the documents. We'll bring it to a vote. But as Lena opened her security console to prepare, her eyes caught something that shouldn't have been there, an outdated access port. A name she hadn't seen in years. Her fingers froze above the keys. Failsafe root. Hale, legacy admin. Her stomach turned. She clicked again. Every camera, every document archive, every shadowed corner of her empire, Richard had access. Maybe not all of it. Not anymore. But enough. Enough to see. Her hands trembled. She clicked once more, trying to disable it. The screen flashed. Access denied. Then the monitor went black. She stared at her own reflection in the dark screen. Chest rising and falling. The silence pressing on her ribs. A single line of text blinked into view. Your actions are now being recorded. We'll talk soon, publicly. Her breath caught. No alarms. No sirens. Just that sentence and the sound of her own pulse in her ears. A week had passed since the internal newsletter rippled through the company's walls and leaked into the public. The buzz had grown into a roar. Blog posts dissected every vague statement. Employees whispered during elevator rides. And the name Greystone started trending for all the wrong reasons. It was time. Lena called an emergency board meeting. The agenda was blunt and clear. Revoke Richard Hale's executive shareholder authority. The location? The boardroom on the 28th floor, a space Richard himself had commissioned decades earlier. Designed with warm wood and floor-to-ceiling windows, it once embodied transparency and ambition. Now, it held tension like a charged wire. As board members filed in, some shared polite nods, others avoided eye contact altogether. Most of the faces were unfamiliar to Richard, new allies Lena had positioned carefully over the past few years. But a few old names still remained. Among them Roger Lynn, a sharp-minded investor with a history of siding with reason, not politics. Lena opened the meeting with the confidence of someone rehearsed. She stood tall, her navy blazer crisp, her voice deliberate. We are here today to address a matter of grave concern. She began. Mr. Hale, though respected for his legacy, has engaged in a pattern of behavior that undermines our current leadership structure, compromises internal protocols, and threatens the integrity of this organization. She clicked the remote, and a presentation lit up behind her. The first slide read, Unauthorized access, breach of protocol. She went on to detail Richard's unauthorized entry into secured areas, his unsanctioned meetings with staff, and the dissemination of false and damaging information, including external communication with media sources. The environment we are building at Greystone relies on trust, on discipline, on order, Lena declared, and no individual, no matter their past, is above those principles. Several board members exchanged glances. A few nodded subtly. One even tapped his pen in agreement. As Lena approached the final slide and prepared to call the vote, Richard raised a hand. I'd like to respond, he said calmly. Lena stiffened. You are not. Roger interrupted her gently. As per the foundational charter, founding shareholders are entitled to present a response before any vote that affects their status. That clause still stands. The room quieted. Lena stepped back. Richard stood slowly. There was no fire in his tone. Only gravity. I didn't return to take back what I left behind. I came back because I saw something worse than competition. I saw us forgetting who we are. He clicked to a new slide. A visual map unfolded. A simplified trail of financial transfers. One box labeled Greystone Holdings. Arrows branching into Altera Dynamics. Then into 3 shell companies listed in offshore jurisdictions. Below, dates and transaction amounts blinked clearly. I won't point fingers, Richard said. The documents speak for themselves. Funds moved without oversight, checks signed without counter-signatures, and employees who asked questions. Gone. He paused. You don't have to take my word for it. He nodded to Sarah, who cued a screen in the corner. A video clip from Riley Chen's independent broadcast aired live, just minutes old. In it, whistleblowers from Greystone's past shared their stories. One voice shook with emotion. Another held firm, naming departments, dates, ignored reports. As the video ended, silence wrapped the room. Roger leaned forward, eyes on Lena. Why haven't we audited the Peru accounts in over a year and a half? Lena opened her mouth but faltered. Her assistant leaned in, whispering something that drained the color from her face. She straightened, eyes darting toward Richard. We've lost access to the lower archive server. The assistant whispered again, barely audible. We didn't know he still had the back door. Just then, the door opened. Carlos entered in a modest charcoal gray suit, flanked by Sarah and Evan. They carried a simple USB drive and a folder. No fanfare, just evidence. We've been asked to present findings from the off-network archives, Carlos said. These records were not included in the most recent audit reports. Evan loaded a short video, captured through the emergency surveillance system Richard had preserved. It showed Lena issuing a direct verbal command to seal off the basement records and disable the security system without documentation. Her voice, clear and firm, echoed through the room. If they go down there, lock it. I don't want anything getting out of that floor. The clip ended. The room felt colder than when they arrived. Another board member, quiet until now, whispered under his breath, "She's gone too far." Roger took a breath. We've heard both sides. I propose we vote. The room stirred. Papers shuffled. Hands moved. 9 members. A simple majority would decide. The count was swift. 6 against removing Richard's authority. 3 in favor. Lena's motion failed. Roger then made a new motion. An independent investigation into Greystone's finances over the past 3 years and the immediate suspension of executive authority for Lena Whitmore until its conclusion. The vote passed. As chairs creaked and murmurs swelled, Lena stood frozen, her eyes locked on Richard. No anger this time, just realization. Carlos turned off the projector. Sarah gathered the documents. Richard didn't gloat. He simply said, "It's not about punishment. It's about setting things right." As they filed out of the room, the sun peeked through the western windows. The light hit the polished conference table, gleaming, clean, unhidden. For the first time in years, the air inside that room felt honest. Lena didn't speak a word as she exited the Greystone building. No angry outbursts, no final declarations. She simply walked out, her heels soft against the polished floor, her figure framed by the tall glass doors as they closed behind her. No one clapped, no one stopped her, just a quiet corridor of watchful eyes, some judging, some confused, some just silent. She carried only a single item, a small black USB drive tucked into the inside pocket of her coat. No briefcase, no entourage, just that slim device, containing the fragments of a reign that once gripped an empire. Outside, her former colleague Paul Granger waited by the curb. He was one of the few who hadn't fully turned on her, yet he hadn't defended her either. Just stood still in the middle, a neutral witness to her rise and fall. She didn't greet him, just leaned slightly and asked, voice dry, "Do you think I was wrong?" Paul looked down the street, took a breath, and replied softly, "You forgot people aren't metrics. You can't manage a soul with a spreadsheet." Lena gave a faint nod. Half smile perhaps, but nothing more. Then she turned and walked away, fading into the city's morning bustle. Back upstairs, in a quieter part of the building that hadn't changed much in years, Richard gathered Martin, Carlos, Sarah, and Evan. The office still smelled faintly of old paper and polished wood. It felt like memory lived in the walls. Richard stood with one hand in his pocket, the other resting on the edge of a weathered desk. "I'm not coming back to run this company," he said calmly, "but I am going to rebuild its foundation. And that starts with how we train, how we hire, and how we treat the ones who don't wear a title." The group listened, not with wide eyes, but steady ones. They knew he meant it. Carlos was the first to speak. "What do you want me to do?" Richard turned to him, the corner of his mouth lifting just a bit. "You already started. I just need you to lead the team that puts people first. We'll call it Greystone Human Code." The name wasn't fancy, but it felt real. Sarah was officially promoted to head of internal audits. Her sharp instincts and unwillingness to stay quiet had earned more than just praise. Evan's suspension was reversed, and he was reinstated with full authority to overhaul the data security system. Martin, though older now and mostly content with a quieter life, agreed to return as honorary legal advisor. Across social media, the story exploded, not because of Richard's return, but because of Carlos, the man who used to clean floors and refill soap dispensers, now shaking hands with executives. Not because he manipulated anyone, but because he didn't. In a world full of performance, people noticed his decency. The headlines called it the janitor who changed the game. And Carlos? He just smiled and kept showing up early, the same way he always had. Later that week, Richard sat at his old desk and wrote something by hand. It had been years since he'd sent a physical memo, but this one had to be different. He folded the paper carefully and had it delivered to every department, mailed, not emailed. The note read, "A company can survive on profit, but it only grows with respect. I didn't return to punish anyone. I came back to remind us that Greystone isn't just a building. It's every person doing the right thing, especially when no one's watching." Employees taped the message above desks, pinned it on breakroom boards, and whispered it to new hires. As for Lena, she didn't disappear into some exotic country or launch a startup. She sat in a quiet cafe, far from the glossy buildings and buzzwords. Her coat was folded on the chair beside her. A warm coffee steamed gently in front of her. She opened her laptop, plugged in the lone USB, and waited. A single folder appeared. Inside, one image. It was a photograph taken years ago, on her very first day at Greystone. She stood beside a much younger Richard Hale, both of them smiling stiffly but earnestly. Her blazer too big, his tie crooked, written in thick pen across the bottom. "Welcome to the future." She stared at it for a long time. Didn't cry, didn't smile either, just stared. Then, slowly, she closed the laptop, finished her coffee, and left the cafe without saying a word. Outside, the wind picked up, cold, but not unkind. The world moved on. So did she. The internal investigation launched by the board unfolded with all the weight and scrutiny one might expect from a company trying to repair a cracked foundation. A third-party audit firm was brought in, serious, quiet professionals who spoke in clipped tones and carried folders thicker than phone books. They moved through Greystone's offices like surgeons, carefully lifting the layers. Within days, old names and forgotten departments began reappearing in the system. Ghost subsidiaries, labeled as inactive or under reorganization, started surfacing. Many followed a familiar financial pattern: round numbers, identical timestamps, and long strings of transfers routed through shell companies scattered across multiple countries. But while the surface looked promising, the legal landscape proved far more treacherous. Some of the most critical files had been destroyed, not corrupted, not misplaced, gone. Others were tied to offshore entities held in the names of individuals now legally deceased or mysteriously unreachable. The audit team flagged them, but without direct ownership links. Prosecution was a foggy path. Then came Lena's move. Her attorney filed a motion to challenge the board's temporary suspension, arguing lack of concrete evidence for any criminal wrongdoing. The media, which had praised Richard's return only days before, now split sharply. One outlet questioned whether his surprise comeback was just a power play wrapped in moral rhetoric. And the pressure began to trickle down. Carlos, despite the attention and new title, started to feel it most. He'd been welcomed into boardrooms, handed polished summaries to review, even asked to give feedback on future company values. But in the break room, old habits crept back. People who once ignored him now praised every word he said. Some were sincere, some not. He overheard whispers one afternoon, just as he passed by the elevators. Just lucky. Wrong place. Right time. Carlos didn't say anything, but he carried that whisper with him the rest of the day. Like a stone in his shoe. Richard noticed. That evening, he asked Carlos to join him back at the old executive conference room. The one where everything had started. The lights were dim, and most of the furniture had been cleared out. But one thing remained. An old wooden panel carved with a simple phrase. Character is doing the right thing when nobody's watching. Richard stood beside it, brushing his fingers across the grain. I didn't lift you up just to make a point, he said, voice low. I didn't do this to prove a janitor can sit at the table. Carlos looked at him, waiting. I did it because you're the only one I saw doing the right thing when it wasn't expected. That's leadership, Carlos. Not fancy titles, not perfect words, but courage, in quiet places. Carlos didn't respond immediately. He just nodded, a slow, honest nod. Meanwhile, Sarah was facing her own battles. She had received 2 anonymous emails, one directly threatening, the other accusing her of poisoning the culture with her reports. One even suggested that she'd be held responsible for tanking the company's stock value. Still, she kept digging. One morning, Richard called for a private town hall, not for media, not for headlines, but for the employees. He stood behind a modest podium in the same break area where you once sat quietly with a cup of lukewarm coffee. No press release, no marketing slogans. He didn't name names. He didn't call out individuals tied to the corruption. Instead, he proposed something few expected, an internal transparency declaration. We will open a path, he said, for anyone who wants to come forward with knowledge, with guilt, or with fear. If you speak up fully, honestly, and without delay, we will protect you. This isn't about punishment, it's about rebuilding trust. Martin had warned him against this route. You're letting people off too easy. He argued in private. They should be held accountable. Richard had simply replied, we're not here to swing the same sword. We're here to build a different kind of ground. Then, just when the storm seemed to settle into uneasy ripples, a new wave struck. A sealed envelope arrived at Richard's desk. No return address. Inside, a short handwritten note. I was wrong to stay silent. It's time someone else said it. The letter was from Paul Granger. Attached was a scanned contract. A private agreement, signed and notarized, shown Lena had purchased hidden voting proxies from 2 board members during her rise. Not through direct transactions, but through a web of stock options hidden in shell partnerships. On paper, it looked like strategic investment restructuring. But in truth, it was leverage, control over board votes that had appeared legitimate but were anything but. Richard read the documents in silence. No anger, no triumph, just a deeper understanding of how far Lena had gone, and how much she had once believed in her own version of order. He closed the folder and looked out the window. Below, employees crossed the courtyard, some laughing, some rushing to meetings. He thought of Lena in that coffee shop. The USB, the old photo. Justice, he knew, didn't always roar like a courtroom drama. Sometimes, it whispered through open doors and second chances. But tonight, it spoke clearly. This battle wasn't just about what had been done. It was about what came next. 90 days after the board's vote and the start of Greystone's internal transformation. The company gathered its people, everyone from the board to the interns, for something unusual. It wasn't a quarterly report or a strategy rollout. There were no slideshows, no financial updates. For the first time in the company's history, there was no keynote speaker. Instead, it was just a microphone in the center of the room, and a quiet invitation. If you have something to share, now's the time. The first to step up was a man in his 60s. Someone most only recognized by his name badge. He had worked in the loading dock for over a decade. His voice cracked slightly as he spoke. 3 months ago, I was late for a shipment because I was helping a janitor fix a coffee machine. I got chewed out in front of everyone. That janitor was Carlos. He never said a word to defend himself. Just took it. The next day, he stood up for me when the same thing happened. No one ever did that before. There was a pause, a quiet shifting in chairs. Then a young intern rose from the side of the room, her hands shaking slightly. I almost quit in my first month. She said, someone spread rumors about me. I didn't think anyone would care. But Sarah did. She pulled me aside and asked me if I was okay. Not about my work, just me. One by one, people began to speak. Some shared small moments, a compliment from someone they admired, a silent act of kindness, an apology that came out of nowhere. Others told heavier stories, ones they had carried for years, buried beneath layers of performance reviews and unread suggestions in HR inboxes. There were tears, there was laughter, but most of all, there was something different in the air. It no longer felt like a corporate meeting. It felt like a room full of people finally realizing they were more than job titles. At the very back of the hall, Richard Hale stood quietly. No spotlight followed him. He leaned slightly on his cane, listening to each voice with the patience of someone who had learned the hard way that silence sometimes teaches more than speeches ever could. Martin stood beside him, arms crossed but smiling. You know, Martin said under his breath, you could walk back into that CEO chair today and no one would question it. Richard didn't answer right away. He watched as a cafeteria worker was helped up to the microphone by two interns. No, he finally replied. If they still need me to hold this together, then I haven't really changed anything. Across town, in a quiet government building with no signs out front, Lena sat at a long table under fluorescent lights. She was composed, even calm, not defiant, just clear. A federal investigator flipped through documents, pages still warm from the printer. Why did you do it? The woman asked her. You had to know it would catch up to you. Lena looked up, not proud, not ashamed either. I believed I was the only one rational enough to keep it all from falling apart. She said, I was afraid of what kindness without structure might do. The investigator made a note but didn't press further. Lena didn't offer excuses. She didn't beg for forgiveness. She didn't pretend to be a martyr. She was simply done. Weeks later, Greystone introduced its new internal voting system. Every department, from marketing to maintenance, nominated representatives. No appointments, no political favors, just names written on paper. Votes cast in person. Carlos was nominated for a high-level strategy role. He declined. Instead, he requested to stay with the cultural team, where he could continue his work welcoming new hires and telling them the truth about where the company had been, and where it hoped to go. Evan established an independent watchdog office, reporting outside the company hierarchy, with a single mission: protect whistleblowers. No passwords from upper management. No backdoors. Real privacy. Sarah was quietly voted onto the Human Council, a new committee designed to challenge decisions that failed to consider the people they affected. For the first time in Greystone's history, someone from operations, not finance or law, had a seat at the strategy table. And Richard? He kept his promise. He didn't return to the CEO office. He cleared out his corner desk, kept only a single keepsake, a carved block of wood that once hung behind his chair. The same one Carlos had stopped to read months ago. On a soft spring morning, Richard returned to the lobby where all of this had started. The same polished floors, the same tall glass windows. But the faces were different now. Not because people had changed, but because they were finally being seen. He approached the front desk. A young woman behind it smiled warmly. Good morning, sir. Can I help you with anything? No, Richard said, smiling gently. You already have. He turned toward the sunlight, slipping his hands into his coat pockets. The warmth hit his face. And for the first time in a long while, he felt no weight on his shoulders. No role to play. No war left to fight. Behind him, the company he once built was breathing again. Ahead of him, there was only light. And this time, it didn't need anyone to guard it. Sometimes, the greatest shift in a company, or in life, doesn't start with a boardroom decision, but with a simple act of kindness in the hallway. This story wasn't just about exposing corruption or reclaiming power. It was about reminding us that dignity, respect, and integrity still matter. What would you do if no one was watching? Would you still choose to be kind? If this story moved you, don't forget to subscribe to Undercover Truths for more powerful stories that peel back the layers and reveal what truly matters behind the scenes. We've got so much more to share, and we'd love to have you with us.